Applebaum is a historian and staff writer at The Atlantic. She's written extensively on the rise of authoritarianism, and she joins me now from Warsaw. Anne, it's always great to have you on the show. So let's talk about this Africa summit that has just wrapped up in St. Petersburg. 17 African leaders attended it, compared with 43 in 2019, and they issued a few joint statements. One of unity, I'll read that to you. Russia and African countries agree to pursue compensation for colonialism, return of cultural artifacts, etc. But then the chair of the African Union goes on to say Putin's grain offer is not sufficient. Obviously, this grain offer after he pulled out of the grain deal with Ukraine, saying that Russia alone can supplement grain to African countries. The chair says a ceasefire is needed, and then went on to say Putin has shown readiness to negotiate with Ukraine, and now the, quote, other side needs to be persuaded. What should we read into this summit, its outcome, and Russia's continued influence in Africa?
So I think, first of all, we can read into the summit the fact that Putin is losing influence in Africa. This has been true for some time. And I think the ending of the grain export arrangement with Ukraine and the bombing of the port in Odessa has had an impact. And I've heard several African leaders criticize him for that. And I think the Russian propaganda is beginning to fall apart, because propaganda works when there's some grain of truth to it, or when there's something about it that people want to believe. But the fact is that Putin is destroying the grain trade. He's created much higher international prices, and that's hard to hide. And so you have a series of leaders who are really no longer willing to meet with him and are no longer willing to repeat what he's been saying. I mean, Russia still has a lot of influence in Africa, partly through the Wagner Group, which is another intriguing and strange, aspect of this whole story. The Wagner Group keeps in power several African dictatorships, and so they also have an interest in maintaining their links to Russia. But I'm not sure that this summit is really, a demonstration of Russian strength or Russian influence.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway, it appears for many, including myself, is the photo of the former head, the current head, I don't know what his role is right now, of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin. We do know that he seems to be alive and well thus far in St. Petersburg, and there you see him standing with a Central African Republic representative. You talk about the role and the relationship between Wagner and these African countries. Once again, it does appear to not only question what, if any, response Putin will have against Prigozhin, given that failed mutiny, but also the power that he does seem to still wield with these countries.
So one of the things I think we failed to understand, or some people failed to understand, was the importance that Wagner has for Putin and for the kind of Kremlin network more broadly. Wagner is Russia's foreign policy in Africa. Wagner is also probably the source of a lot of money for Putin cronies. It's not so easy to just cut him off or get rid of him. And they created him over many years as a kind of, as I say, a sort of alternate form of foreign policy. He does the dirty work in Africa. He supports dictatorships. He sends in mercenaries to help people out. And at the same time, he controls supposedly gold mines and other kinds of natural resources and exploits them. And then that money goes back to Moscow. And just eliminating that turned out to be too difficult, even after he ran that extraordinary rebellion. And so I think what we're seeing is, again, the development with the visible, development of cracks within the Russian leadership. And they were probably there already. We just weren't able to see them quite so clearly. Different people have different interests, and they're beginning to compete with one another.
So what does this say about Putin's mindset right now? Not only managing a war that clearly didn't go as he had planned, but also now the aftermath of this failed mutiny. There's new reporting from the Washington Post this week from sources in U.S. intelligence confirming that Vladimir Putin seemed to have just frozen for 24 hours or so when this mutiny was taking place, even though he apparently had been given a heads up. Your recent piece on the rebellion argued that after spending years of cultivating public apathy, the Russian president found his people indifferent to his own fate. I recently interviewed Russian journalist Mikhail Zygar, and he said that all of his sources confirmed that Putin's decisions are a bit strange. How should we be interpreting all of this?
Yeah, so just to explain what I wrote, For many, many years, the Russian state has been encouraging citizens to be apathetic, and they do this deliberately. So they do it by emitting confusing and contradictory propaganda, by discouraging people from forming any kind of independent groups or associations, never mind politics or political parties. And then when there was a real attack on the Russian state or on the Russian army, it meant that citizens were apathetic about that too. Even more strange was when Wagner and his men were in Rostov, which is essentially the military capital, the city from which the operations in Ukraine are being run. Passerby and people walking down the street seemed to welcome them. They brought them bottles of water and ice cream and all kinds of other things. And it was almost as if finally there were some politics to follow. There was someone interesting to listen to who was saying something a little bit different, and they seemed almost interested and intrigued by it. Because he's shut down conversation so much, almost any appearance of change or anything out of the unusual suddenly becomes important and significant. And I think the Prigozhin rebellion, the after effect of that, continues. People are they want to know what's going to happen next. Who's going to be the next challenger? Where will the next crack become visible? So in a way, the Prigozhin rebellion restarted a political conversation in Moscow that seemed to have been pretty dead.
Yeah, and Kremlin propagandists for a good 24 hours didn't even know how to respond to this attempted mutiny because they were given no direct orders from the Kremlin as to how to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, no direct orders, and Putin himself left the capital. He disappeared. Yeah. So first giving a speech in which he, virtually compared himself to Nicholas II. He started talking about the Russian Revolution, which was clearly on his mind, and then he vanished, which left people speculating he left the city of Moscow preparing for an invasion. People were digging ditches outside of the city. They were given a curfew and told to stay home from work. So it left its mark as, I think, probably the first time that the war in Ukraine has really been brought home to people in the capital city.
And it still raises questions about the actual popularity he has among Russian people at home. It's very difficult to obviously conduct polling in the country. You talk about the apathy that's felt throughout the country. He still seems to be quite popular, at least with some part of the population. But I was really struck, and it's almost comical if this wasn't a reality. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said today on RT, quote, "The Ukrainians hate and are very aggressive towards Putin exactly because they want him to be president." So we can question, I think, how Russians feel about Vladimir Putin. I would argue that it's pretty apparent how Ukrainians feel about him.
It's pretty apparent. I mean, that's a weird form of Russian propaganda where they try and project their own problems onto other people. So maybe what she's trying to tell us is that Russians aren't respecting Putin enough, and therefore she's trying to find hatred somewhere else. I mean, who knows? Their thinking is now very convoluted. And as I say, one of the aspects of Russian propaganda that makes it hard for outsiders to understand is that they deliberately say things that are confusing and contradictory precisely in order to make people say, right, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what's true. Everything is fake. I'm staying away from politics. I don't want to know anything at all. And I think that was, yet another contribution to that genre. I mean, remember, the Russians are now in the very difficult position of having to explain why it is that the Ukrainians are making progress, why it is they haven't given up, why they aren't Russians. Remember, the war began because Putin said, the Ukraine is part of Russia. As soon as we walk into Kiev, everybody will give up. None of that has happened. It's been more than a year and a half. And they need explanations, and they're beginning to run short of them.
Yeah, and they're going to have to explain somehow why Russia is now apparently weapon shopping in the hermit state of North Korea as well. Ann Applebaum, always great to have you on and your perspective. Thank you. We appreciate it.